I think it's always important to ask the right questions to get the answers we really need to be able to treat the patients better than we did before. Well, guidelines are extremely important, especially the modern evidence-based guidelines, because they summarize the highest quality of evidence and the most current evidence that should be used in the clinical practice, day-to-day practice.
They're only really as good as the best evidence that you've got around a medicine or a treatment. And that does pose some challenges for us because the bulk of the evidence on which they're based is based on double-blind randomised controlled trials. And one of the challenges of that is that really very few patients that make it into those trials represent the general populations that we treat.
So regulators use clinical trial data. They want to have a well-controlled trial. They want to show that drug A prevents an outcome from disease B. You can really only show that from a controlled trial. Observational data, however, are useful if you're looking for a rare side effect, but they can be confounded.
The ideal of a clinical trial or a randomised trial is to reduce external confounding factors and make internal consistency. The problem is we do two things to the population that may actually mean our results are not broadly representative. So the first is we often require a narrow population because then they can all perform the same way. But on top of that, they also have to subject themselves to an incredibly tight ecology of care where they're actually managed, seen very frequently, well-trained, fill in diary cards and monitored.
The guidelines for asthma are based on non-smoking patients. So there, the drugs that are now standard for asthma work very good in the non-smoking population. However, in real life, 30 to 40% of patients smoke or have smoked in the past. And now it becomes clear that these drugs do not work as well in the smoking asthmatics.
Doctors have to make judgment calls outside the guidelines, and we're not always sure that what we're doing is actually the right thing.
For randomized controlled trials, we have to ask the question, is the drug working? But for real-life evidence, we have completely different questions. Is this drug also working for my patients who is maybe smoking or drinking or has comorbidities, or maybe is not compliant or doesn't like the way the inhaler works? What could happen if you rely too much on the results of randomized controlled trials is that you harm the patient with the wrong treatment. Because the patients that you see in your clinic are not the same patients that have been selected for the randomized controlled trials. So that is the worst case scenario. But also in terms of costs, if you give the wrong medications to the wrong patients, then you can still have uncontrolled disease because the drug is not working in that particular group of patients.
And there you need a pragmatic trial where you loosen the inclusion and exclusion criteria, where you add the medication to the other medications patients may take. You take people who are just ordinarily affected with this illness and find out whether the benefit that you saw when you were controlling everything can show up in a trial where you're not controlling much at all.
Many serious adverse effects like cancer or heart attacks you only see on the long run or in very large populations. Such large populations can never be entered in randomized controlled trials because it's much too expensive.
Of course, when one's looking at real-life research, we have to subject it to exactly the same amount of intellectual rigour as we're talking about with randomised trials. So real life is not an excuse for shoddy research. It's actually incredibly important that there are quality standards applied to that, just the same way. So one of the things that the Respiratory Effectiveness Group has called for in its recent ARCH supplement and also a recent Breathe article is real quality markers, pre-registering studies, independent steering committees, many of the same things as we would expect from a randomised trial.
The challenge is there for all of us, really, to be broader minded about how we approach these data sets. And we do need structures and systems to look at them. And I think these are emerging at the moment, but I think it's that that's held us back.
There has been quite a change, though, in the GINA guidelines. And the last version actually calls for an understanding of phenotypes, so the different types of patients, and also to think about effectiveness, things like inhaler technique. Also, when asthma is not controlled. In the past, it just says increase treatment. Now it says think about why someone's uncontrolled. So that's a much more real-life approach. So there's been a big change, actually, in the attitude within the GINA guidelines. So I think there's a change occurring, and it's going to continue to evolve.
The relevant scientific bodies like the medical societies, but also the journals and the authorities, regulatory authorities, they have to come together and try to find better ways to do this observational research, to improve the quality and to really make that it will have an added value on top of the randomized controlled trials.
It is part of the key questions we ask when we're developing a medicine is this medicine suitable to be used in a real-world study setting? But we don't universally apply it just yet. And I think looking at other companies around me, I think they're thinking similar ways.
Well, real-world studies are just where they belong in the evidence hierarchy. There just aren't enough of them. And that's because it's hard to convince a funding body to study something that you think you already know. So it's not the people who are making up the list of what's important, it's the people who are giving out the money.
The cost and novelty of real-world studies versus the traditional double-blind randomised controlled trials may well be one of the reasons why the industry's been slow to move into this new space. I think that's completely understandable. I mean, we're at the early stages, really, of having schemes to look at this data and an understanding of how to interpret it.
I think we let the people who tell us they're good at doing systematic reviews do systematic reviews, and then we forget about the fact, did it really apply to our patients? The other danger, on the other hand, is the payers make all the decisions based on their review of what they think is real-life data, and again, we weren't included. And actually, we as clinicians looking after patients and understanding the real questions, and it is the real questions that matter, need to think about all of those different strands. So it's about actually putting us as clinicians back in the centre of things, I think.
The dream world would be one where there are clear quality standards that everyone accepts for how real-world data should be developed and the conduct of those studies. Secondly, there should be frameworks to help people understand the different types of real-world data so that we all talk the same language. Thirdly, I'd like to see some of the studies that we've got going have impact and actually be applied to guidance for patients and actually be proven to have benefit. Now, to do that, there needs to be a broad understanding and acceptance of this type of data. I think there are challenges for academics, clinicians, and actually also for journal editors and journal reviewers to really understand how this data fits in. And then ultimately, guideline writers will be able to make some sense of this and help us ultimately use the best data to do the best for our patients with our medicines.
My hope really is that I think we're going to be clearer on our questions, much clearer on our interpretation of the evidence. What did it really tell us? And what's its strengths and its weaknesses? And what does this other evidence tell us? So let's give people a more honest appraisal of things and let them make better decisions. Now, that's going to mean slightly less clear-cut guidelines. That's not a bad thing, because truth isn't always as clean as we'd like it to be.
We know about randomized controlled trials for decades. We know exactly what a good trial is, how it should be designed, properly randomized, properly controlled, preferably double-blind, etc., etc. But for observational trials, that is much less clear, and we really have to have new standards on how to design properly these types of studies.